Yep, I should be good to go up here. Okay, I am Dr. Whom. I'm here to talk about cat herding in the Wild Wild West. So, currently, who am I? Why am I up here talking about this? Currently work for Cigital Incorporated, but most of this talk is about some work I did running the CFP for Circle City Con, which was Indianapolis's first Hackercon we held back in June. And also I'm on the organizing committee for LASER, the learning from authoritative security experiment results. So a lot of that is trying to push more evidence-based security, primarily to the academic community, but still useful. And so what are we going to talk about today then? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about this.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family. Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy. Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs.
But really, what we're going to talk about is running a Hackercon CFP, which is a lot like herding cats. So specifically, I have two major points I want to cover. First off, I want to talk about some lessons I learned running a Hackercon CFP in terms of helping it run more smoothly, getting speakers in, things like that. But also, I want to talk to people who are interested in submitting talks to Hackercon CFPs about, as a committee, what I looked for as chair and what I urged my reviewers to look for. So, I've got 6 lessons I'd like to cover during the course of this talk. First off, I'm going to talk about what I had to do during my role as a CFP chair and the structure of what we wanted. Next, talk about some of the issues we had with our conference software in terms of choosing talks, accepting talks, problems like that. Then, picking talks, notifying speakers, and the interesting multi-stage CFP process we had at Circle City Con that we're going to continue to push forward. Next, the problems we ran into after or during the con that surprised us and the lessons we learned from that. Also, the importance of taking care of your speakers during a talk. And finally, some lessons that I'm going to take into next year's Circle City Con, as well as the upcoming B-Sides Indianapolis CFP that we're going to open up sometimes around October 1st. So, cowboy boots, saddling up, and catnip. An idea of, so, what it was to pick up my role as CFP chair and the structure of what we wanted during Circle City Con. And so when you're running a conference and you're trying to choose talks, there's a really interesting internal fight that you have regarding the conference goals. In many ways, running a conference, say like DerbyCon or Circle City Con, is in many ways equal parts entertainment, equal parts education, and equal parts networking. So in some ways, you need to balance between some big names, because of course there's some talks that just draw crowds in. New ideas, bringing up interesting new ideas the community hasn't heard before to try and move the community forward. But also the idea of fostering discussion. So for example, Chris's talk right before this, he's given a version of that at Circle City Con. And we already see at the end of the last session, talks like that really foster some interesting discussion, especially on how can we use some of the techniques we formulated in information security to make the world a better place. And the other important thing is, what could we do at Circle City Con to really differentiate ourselves? Of course, we've got in the area up in Michigan, there's GerCon. Down here in Louisville, there's DerbyCon. There's events in Ohio. There's ThoughtCon in Illinois. And the idea is every con really needs to find its own place, its own feeling. And one of the ways you can do that is determining how you want to handle speakers and the talks that you have during that conference. The next lesson is about always testing your software. And this actually came up when we started using the OpenConf software, which is a popular conference submission software used in academic communities. And I know ShmooCon has used it. I'm not sure if they're still using it, but I've heard they've messed with it previously. The idea being what this software does is it allows a way for speakers to sign in, upload their talk, and fill out a number of forms. And then the sort of special features is it allows that single blind or double blind setup that a lot of academic conferences used. So reviewers don't know who the speakers are, and speakers don't know who the reviewers are in the case of double blind. Or more commonly, usually speakers don't know who the reviewers are. In that case, it's single blind. Now, the problem we had with OpenConf is usually the submission system worked fine, but of course we only wanted text submissions. Of course, the last thing you want from a bunch of hackers uploading talks is PDFs, Word documents with macros, you name it. Of course, the funny thing is, we put on their file type checker, we would like text only. I don't know what the heck happened, but we had at least one PDF, 1 or 2 PowerPoints, a Word document, and I think we had one other format. So one thing we probably should have done is actually, instead of trusting that the file type checking worked, actually tried to upload a couple things and see if they would pass muster. The other problematic issue I ran into, and this was probably because where we were hosting it, that the email functionality didn't work for notifying speakers they have been accepted, rejected, etc. So I now had to manage a spreadsheet of multiple columns over multiple rounds and manually email speakers with my email account. Now on one side, I think some people enjoyed the personal touch. But from an organizing perspective, when you're having to keep track of these things, especially when speakers potentially pull out their talks later, it becomes a big hassle. Finally, we had this issue with some form fields being confusing for our submitters. And that was predominantly because we were trying to reuse some fields in the academic submission process for information that is usually collected during the Hackercon process, such as personal bios. And sometimes people would start putting their names in various fields that we didn't want names in because it was a double-blind talk. And then our reviewers would know who the speakers were. So the important lesson I learned from that is spend a couple days, start uploading things, try and test your software. The third lesson is one that we learned from Spider-Man long ago, and that was with great power comes great responsibility. And this has to do with the fact that as chair, you're really in charge of pointing the direction of who's talking and what they're going to be talking about. And so there's important decisions to be made regarding the criteria. And one fight that I think we really had internally, a sort of philosophical fight, was this big name versus new speakers. And what won out, and I think rightly so, is new speakers. Trying to get many people who we haven't seen elsewhere to come up and be able to give their first talk. And sometimes they can then proceed that talk, get feedback, and move it on to other conferences such as DEF CON, DerbyCon, ShmooCon, etc. And in that way, we can really help grow the community and get some new faces out there. But then you have the other old fight that we generally have, that we hear every year, and that's this idea of, well, do we want to have a bunch of talks about neat tricks, or do we want to have more defensive talks? You know, red team versus blue team. And oddly enough, something that I was really happy about with Circle CityCon is, given that we have this constant fight about trying to bring more defense talks into conferences, we actually had probably, of the I think it was 30-some slots that we had talks for. A vast majority were either blue team talks or the sort of hybrid red team, blue team talks. We had three, I think it was 3 to 4 distinct red team talks for the whole thing. So I was really happy about that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this idea of form letters versus personal emails. And I'm still debating this for next year, if I want to do more personal emails, give it a personal touch, versus rely on conference software that I hopefully test and make sure works this upcoming year. And finally, as chair, you have a big responsibility for training reviewers to give quality reviews, especially if you're relying on the multi-stage CFP process that I'm going to talk about a little bit later for those who didn't go through it. So moving on to the next lesson, this idea of, oh crap, where's my underwear? Having things we thought to do only after the process has started and continued. So one issue that gets run into is speaker gifts. Of course, DerbyCon for Full Talks gives honorariums. Other conferences do other things. Well, we wanted to give back to our speakers too. Of course, then the problem is, well, when you think of that, before you start trying to determine the details of that and let the speakers know, you have to look at the money, you have to look at all these other aspects of logistics and feasibility. The problem was notifying speakers before doing those other things is usually not a good idea, because then you just feel like crap when you have to email everybody back and say, well, we wanted to do shirts, but we're sorry, couldn't bring it out of the budget. The other thing that came up during the day of the conference was speaker introductions. We realized, oh man, we should probably have someone get on stage, introduce the speaker. I think it's a nice personal touch. And so, of course, the veritable Johnny Xmas was around, so it was easy to just rope him up, get him on stage for about 5 minutes, and start introducing speakers. And finally, we ran into an issue of, oh, we probably should find a convenient way of getting information out of the CFP system and onto the websites for scheduling. And this initially started with cutting and pasting until I dug through the menus and found a way to export Excel spreadsheets. But one of the great things you can do eventually is, as technical people, we probably should have written a script that would download it, parse it, and pop it up on a website real fast. So milk saucers and cat naps, how do you treat your speakers? So first off, you got to give them CFP notifications early enough, probably about 2 months in advance. And also, and something that we do, I've seen here at DerbyCon, is this idea of a speaker ready room. And it's something we wanted to do at Circle City Con but couldn't pull off. And I feel a little bad because it's always nice to have a place for your speakers to practice. I remember sitting in the network room at Circle City Con and seeing Beltface practice his talk against the whir of this giant Sun server that somebody brought in and dropped off to see if they could get it working. And it was sort of like he was practicing in the face of a jet engine. And the other thing, things that cost money, this idea of, well, it would be nice to put a keg in the speaker room and have them a way of sort of relaxing before they talk. Of course, there's the balance of make sure they don't get too drunk before going off and giving their talk. So there's a number of things that, as you're running a CFP, you have to think of besides just the papers themselves. How to take care of your speakers when the conference comes. And finally, a number of lessons that I will take with me into next year's CFP. First off, integrating the scheduling of the CFPs and the website, get those together. We're definitely looking at rolling our own system here pretty soon to integrate some of the special aspects that we do in Hackercon CFPs that academics don't do. And it's really not an easy job. It's a lot more work than I originally intended, but it's really fulfilling, especially when you can go to conferences afterwards and see what was cultivated, what talks progressed, and how they progressed. So let's get on to the part that I think a lot of people are interested in, and that is you wanting to be a speaker at a Hackercon. And I think we all have one of our good friends here, who has both been a speaker at a Hackercon and in front of House congressional committees. So we're going to cover a bit here about making a quality talk and submitting it to a CFP and what you can do to try and help that be a success. One thing I'm not going to cover is presentation tips. There's a ton of talks on that, and there's a number of people who have probably covered it way better than I can. So I'll do that in about the last 10 minutes of this talk. So what we have first is crafting your submission. This is probably one of the most important parts. When you're working on a talk, you should start thinking about what is your catch, what are your points, what are you bringing to the table. So one lesson that was given to me by a colleague, if you're doing a stable talk like this, have 2 main points. If you're doing a full 50-minute talk, try and come up with 3 main points. And if you're going to do a demo talk, start working on this tech demo and the technical information early. Have a lab notebook. This could be a wiki, this could be a personal notebook. And as you start your project, start writing notes of your step-by-step process. Start writing down the details. Because what's going to happen is when you get ready to write up that talk, that lab notebook, those notes that you wrote down, that's what you're going to turn into slides in your slide deck. You can also release that lab notebook afterwards in case you want to have people look at your process or be able to repeat that process without looking over the slides. Now, after you have your idea, you sort of have your outline of sort of what you want your talk to be, you have your points down, you need to start writing up the submission. Now, what we wanted for submissions at Circle City Con and what I will continue to want in the future is first you have a detailed abstract. A lot of times the reviewers, I sometimes think they predominantly read the abstract, and they'll definitely read the abstract if the talk organization write-up is not very thorough. But what I would strongly suggest is having a very thorough write-up of your talk outline, because that serves 2 purposes. First, it's going to give the committee, it's going to give the reviewers a good idea of the length and duration of your talk and the depth of material that you're going to cover. I mean, I know there's a number of times where we've all gone in to 50-minute talks only to find out we're leaving 20, 30 minutes later because the speaker just did not have enough material prepped. And usually in situations like that, if I were able to see an outline and we were able to get an idea of what was going to be covered in the talk, we can go back to the speaker and we can say, hey, this would be great talk, we like it, but we're going to have to cut it down to a 30-minute slot because there's just not enough material here for you to go on for an hour. And so having a very good, detailed system is great. Just put it in a text document. Usually that's our preferred method of submission because the number of attack vectors you can include in a text document are somewhat slim. Now, if you're going to do a demo, make sure all your code is written and tested before you give the talk. If you need to, have a video ready to go and email the committee and give them a link to the video if you're submitting a talk with a demo. And then they'll have a good idea of what you've already done. And in fact, I think our committee I'd push for talks far more fiercely if I saw a tech talk with a demo included, because that gives us a really good idea of what's going on. Finally, the submission stage of your talk. There's not a lot to it here. First off, the biggest thing, and the thing I hear from everybody I've talked to about running CFPs, is just please read and follow the directions. For the bigger conferences, I know this is a pain in the butt for them. The number of times people have submissions and they do everything wrong or part of the things wrong, a lot of places will just throw your submission out. So be very careful, be very thorough, and read the directions and make sure you're following them to the T. Also, edit and spell check your submission. The last thing that reviewers like to see is bad grammar. Spelling probably is somewhat forgivable unless it's completely grotesque. And just make sure you edit and streamline your submission. Make sure what you've written is clear before you hit that submit button. So to close up this session, I'm going to cover a few points of things I'd like to see in Hackercon call for papers. First, I'd like to see more diverse people, more diverse talks, something that I really push for at Circle City Con. I remember going to a security summit, and one of the people in the summit roughly quoting them as, well, we're sitting here and we're a bunch of rich white guys talking about rich white guy security problems. And that is something that needs to change in security conferences. We need to get more diverse opinions. We need to get people who work, for example, the things that Johnny Long talks about are very interesting because he is dealing with communities that we usually do not hear about at hacker conferences. And getting information about other communities is very important. I think it's very useful for moving our discipline forward and disseminating new information. I also want more diverse ideas. I'd love to see more talks that are a little bit off the reservation. New paradigms, new attack vectors, complex threats. For example, if someone wants to write a talk about this little something that came up at a previous security summit I was at, where let's say you have a Nest fire alarm, a smoke detector, and let's say you have a sleep monitoring app on your smartphone. I want to see a talk that goes through the process and the potential eventual threats of writing an application that every time your writing a virus that says every time your sleep monitor sees you entering REM, it chirps your fire alarm. What can you do with that? Also, I'd love to see talks on hacker hobbies. A lot of the talks here are very educational. What about some of the other things we like to do in our spare time? I think a great example of this was, I believe it was 2 years ago here at DerbyCon, Rogue Clown gives a talk about programming sort of audio in Python. And I thought that was really cool. And finally, double-blind submissions. This idea of, I love conferences where the reviewers don't know the speakers, so the big names and the little names or people who haven't given talks all have equal status. And as always, it still sort of remains the status quo that speakers don't know the reviewers. Now, there's a few caveats with this because some bigger conferences have problems with plagiarism. And this was a sort of surprise to me when I heard this because coming from the academic community, plagiarism, there's a huge social taboo. But I've heard in the security community, there's always problems of, I'd love to hear a talk if it was given by name A, but if it was given by name B, I wouldn't trust that it was any good, and it can be on the exact same topic. So while I'd like to see double blind, I know there's some issues with that. The other thing I want to see is more reviewer comments, more detailed reviewer comments. And this allows better feedback to speakers to help them craft better talks in the future. And I'd also would like to see more training of reviewers as talks are being submitted so that reviewers know what type of comments to give, because I don't want to go down the academic route of having very mean-spirited comments. And finally, multi-stage CFPs with resubmissions. This is something we do for Circle City Con. The idea is, for example, we'll have a 3-stage coming up for this next year at Circle City Con. You have 2 early CFPs and the hard final CFP deadline. If you submit before the first early CFP deadline, you will get reviews back by the end of the deadline for your talk if it was a rejection, and then you can recraft that talk during the second period based on those reviews and resubmit it. We rejudge it. And you get 2 chances at that before the hard CFP deadline. So it's a great way for new speakers to get mentored through this process and come to the con with a submission that may not have been accepted the first time, but by the end, they've got a much better crafted talk that will be great for the conference. So if anybody wants me as a CFP chair, you can either let me know if you're an organizer, or I strongly submit to Circle City Con 2015. The CFP opening for that will be a little ways away in January or February. We're going to try and start that after B-Sides Indy, but the B-Sides Indy CFP is going to be opened here in a few days in early October. So keep an eye open on the internet for the B-Sides event, and we're going to get some information out there. We'd love to see you submit. Love to thank, at the end of this talk, I just want to thank everybody who helped me do reviews for Circle City Con, as well as some of the organizers. They're all there, including InfoSister, Hotjob, BearSec, etc. They're all a big, great help. They put in a lot of time. So thank you all very much, and please submit talks to B-Sides Indy and Circle City Con next year, because I'd love to see all of you.